Hey everybody, here we are back for part 2 of our 14-part series, solving the problems for the end of chapter problems. Okay, so when we left off, we just finished up with question number 7. So let's pick up on question number 8. Okay, give me just a second. This is why you should always bring backup pencils to your AP exam. I was so excited to have a sharpened pencil. All right, best laid plans. And that's an 8. So question number 8. What's the probability that each of the following pairs of parents will produce the indicated offspring, assuming independent assortment? Okay, so we'll look at the parents and then potential offspring, and we'll calculate probabilities. So for scenario A, the parental generation, it will be big A, big A, big B, big B, big C, and then the other parent will be, recessive for everything. And then the kiddos, they want to know what are the odds that their offspring, first filial generation, will be, heterozygous for everything. All right, well, again, if you want, you can set up your sort of fail-safe Punnett square. Here we could use the B alleles if we want, because again, they all sort independently. So, wait a minute. If we look at the scenario, one parent will be homozygous dominant, and the other is homozygous recessive. So you can see right off the bat that all the offspring will be heterozygous, right? So odds that A will be heterozygous, 1. Odds that B will be heterozygous, 1. Odds that C will be heterozygous, 1. So the overall probability, it's 1. All right. Let's do one that's a little more interesting here. Let's skip down to D. If we look at D, for the parents, let's see. One parent has 2 recessive alleles, heterozygous for B and homozygous dominant for C. And the second parent is homozygous dominant for A, heterozygous for B, and homozygous recessive for C. And they want to know what are the odds that their offspring, this first filial generation, will be heterozygous for all 3. Okay, so that's sort of an interesting question. So the odds that the offspring will be heterozygous for the A gene, well, one parent's homozygous dominant, the other's homozygous recessive. So the odds are 1, right? All the offspring will be heterozygous. For B, both parents are heterozygous. Again, you could do a little test Punnett square off to the side if you want. But we know that for them to be heterozygous, the odds are a half. And then for C, again, one parent's homozygous dominant, the other's homozygous recessive. So the odds that their offspring will be heterozygous are 1. Now, they told us that all 3 of these sort independently, so you can calculate the probabilities of each independently, and then you can multiply them together for overall odds. So the odds are a half that the offspring will have this genotype. All right, so that's number 8. Number 9. In the case of number 9, what do we got going on here? It reads, Karen and Steve each have a sibling with sickle cell disease. Neither Karen nor Steve nor any of their parents have the disease, and none of them have been tested to see if they carry the sickle cell allele. Okay, so sickle cell is an inherited condition, and it's caused by a recessive allele. So again, let's say you get a big H, you'll be healthy. If you have just little h's, then you'll have sickle cell disease. Okay, now we know that Karen doesn't have it. So we know Karen at least has a big H. We know Steve doesn't have it. So Steve's got at least a big H. But we don't know whether their second allele makes them vulnerable to that. Now, it says they each have siblings that have the disease. So we know it's in the family, right? So there is a possibility that Karen and Steve each have the recessive allele. Now, let's think about what's going on with Karen's parents. So if we do a Punnett square over here, we know that Karen has a sibling, right, that has sickle cell disease. So that means at least one sibling had sickle cell disease, but then the prompt says that Karen's parents don't have it. So what that suggests to us is that Karen's parents were both heterozygous. So again, one of Karen's siblings had it. So we can say here it is Karen's sibling. But we know that Karen doesn't have the disease. So Karen's parents don't have the disease, but Karen has a sibling that has the disease. So that suggests the parents are both heterozygous, and here's that sibling. So a fair question is, what are the odds that Karen is heterozygous? Well, look no further than over here. Now, some people may go, oh, odds are half that she'd be heterozygous, okay? But one thing we need to know, one thing we need to do is eliminate this possibility, right? Because we know that Karen doesn't have sickle cell disease. So that means if we can eliminate this box, that means the odds are 2 out of 3 that Karen is a carrier for sickle cell disease. For Steve-O, it's going to be a similar situation. If he doesn't have it, he has parents that don't have it, but he has a sibling that does. That means Steve has that as well. Okay, so those are the odds for Karen and Steve. Now it says, calculate the probability that if this couple has a kid, the kid would have sickle cell disease. So the odds that Karen has sickle cell disease are 2 out of 3. The odds that Steve has the odds that Karen is a carrier is 2 out of 3. The odds that Steve is a carrier is 2 out of 3. Now, the thing we follow this up with is that if both are heterozygous, then what are the odds that they'd have a kid who has 2 recessive alleles? Well, if Karen and Steve are both heterozygous, what are the odds they'd wind up with a kid with 2 recessive alleles? That is 1 in 4. So now what we can do is, since Karen is an independent event, Steve is an independent event, and a kid would be an independent event, we can multiply it together, those odds. So here are the odds that Karen is a carrier, the odds that Steve is a carrier, and the odds that if they are carriers, their kid would have it. So that is 4, that's 9, 36, 4 over 36, which equals 1/9. So overall, the odds are 1 in 9 that Karen and Steve could have a kid with sickle cell disease, knowing what we know. So that's sort of fun to work through. Alrighty. Let's see. This is number 11. All right, number 11. Oh, finally, a tiger-based question. It says, in tigers, a recessive allele of a particular gene causes both an absence of fur pigmentation, or a white tiger, and a cross-eyed condition. Okay. Again, if you get a recessive allele, you get white fur and crossed eyes. It'll be quite a tiger. If you get the dominant allele, you get, let's say, typical fur, and then typical eyes. Okay. If two phenotypically normal tigers that are heterozygous at this locus are mated, what percentage of their offspring will be cross-eyed? What percentage will be white-furred? Okay, so the parents are heterozygous. So what are the odds that have offspring that have the recessive allele? It's 1 in 4, or 25%. And the odds that they be, or possess crossed eyes and be white and also white, it's 100%, right? So they've got overall odds that they'll have crossed eyes and white fur of 25%. All right, next up, we've got number 13. Number 13. The pedigree below traces the inheritance of alkaptonuria, a biochemical disorder. Affected individuals, indicated here by the colored circles and squares, are unable to metabolize a substance called alkapton, which colors the urine and stains body tissues. Does alkaptonuria appear to be caused by a dominant allele or a recessive allele? Okay, well, if we look at pedigree here, what I would draw your attention to is Anne and Michael. You notice Anne and Michael don't have the condition, but their daughter, Carla, does. So if the parents don't have it, but the kid does, that's an indication that it's a recessive condition. You have to have 2 recessive alleles. Alrighty. To fill in the genotypes of individuals that can be deduced. Well, again, let's say big H is healthy and little h's means you have the condition. So we know Arlene has it, but George doesn't. Now, some of their kids do, so George must be heterozygous. Tom and Wilma both have the condition, so we know they would be homozygous recessive. Carla is homozygous recessive. Anne and Michael, they don't have it, but their kid does, so they are heterozygous. Let's see. Sam here. Sam doesn't have the condition, but hey, the only thing that Sam's going to get from Arlene is a recessive allele, so Sam must be heterozygous. Well, and these folks are going to be more difficult to discern because we don't know much about Sandra here. Okay, so that's what we can know about genotypes of these individuals. So that's 13. Okay. Oh, well, no, wait a second. We know Daniel and Alan, they don't have it, right? So they have dominant alleles. But what they're going to get from Tom is a recessive allele. So we know at least they'll be heterozygous. Again, we're lacking some information on Sandra, but we can figure that out about Dan and Alan. Okay, sweet. So that's 13. Let's see, what do we got next here? I appreciate your patience as I flip paper over here. Next, we're looking at 14. All right, problem number 14. What do we got going on? It says, imagine that you're a genetic counselor. Oh, okay. And a couple planning to start a family comes to you for information. Charles was married once before, and he and his first wife had a child with cystic fibrosis. The brother of his current wife, Elaine, died of CF. What's the probability that Charles and Elaine will have a baby with CF? Neither Charles, Elaine, nor their parents have CF. Well, we know some stuff about Charles, right? Charles doesn't have CF, but he had a kid that did. So let's say again, if you have a big H, you'll be healthy. And if you have recessive alleles, then you have cystic fibrosis. Now, Charles doesn't have it, but he has a kid that does. So we know Charles is heterozygous. Elaine, well, we don't really know much about Elaine other than that her parents don't have it. So let's go back to the scenario with Elaine's parents. This is like a problem we did earlier, right? We know Elaine's parents didn't have the condition, so they were each heterozygous. Or I'm sorry, we know they didn't have the condition, so they have a dominant allele. What it did say is that Elaine's brother did die of CF. So we know the parents didn't have it, but we know that Elaine's brother did have it, so the parents must be heterozygous. So this is what we know about Elaine's parents. So again, we can deduce things about Charles and Elaine. The odds that Charles is a carrier, it's 1, right? We know that he has had a kid with CF, but he doesn't have it, so odds that he's a carrier is 1. The odds that Elaine is a carrier, that she is heterozygous, we know she doesn't have it, but the odds that she's heterozygous are 2 out of 3. Okay, now the last thing is, what if they both have it? So the odds if, both heterozygous, that they would have a kid that is homozygous recessive. If, again, we just sort of ignore the fact this is Elaine's parents. If this is Charles and Elaine, the odds that they could have CF would be 1 in 4. So again, everybody's an independent event. Charles is an independent event, Elaine's an independent event, and a kid is an independent event. So it's 1 over 1 times 2/3 times 1/4. So that is 2/12 or 1 in 6. So if we know Charles is a carrier and that Elaine had a sibling but not parents with CF, then their odds of having a kid with CF are 1 in 6. All right, I'm going to have to pause here for just a second to take care of some computer stuff and maybe try to sharpen a pencil again. Okay, thank you for your patience with that. Next, we're going to move on to number 15. All right, 15. Level 3, synthesis or evaluation. 15 reads, over the past half century, there has been a trend in the United States and other developed countries for people to marry and start families later in life than did their grandparents or parents or grandparents. Predict what effects this trend might have on the incidence or frequency of late-acting dominant lethal alleles in the population. Okay, so this is more going to be a writing thing. So let's think of it this way. If you have an allele that normally causes death later in life, what that usually means is people have had children by the time they encounter the disease, so they will have passed on that disease to their offspring. If people are having children later in life, well, then it may be the case that they would have already found out about having the disease before having children and would have the possibility that they would choose to not have children. So Huntington disease is an example of this. A lot of times that may not begin to be expressed until a person is in his or her 40s or 50s and would have likely, if they're going to have children, have had them by that time. Now, if this is something where people aren't having kids until later in life, someone may recognize or find out that he or she has Huntington disease and then choose to not have children. If that is the case, then the frequency of that disease may actually decrease over time. So one of the byproducts of people having kids later in life may be a decrease in incidence or frequency of certain sort of late in life genetic conditions, lethal genetic conditions. All right, so that's 15. We'll run out of space. So we got our last one here, number 16. Final problem. All right, 16. What's it saying? You are handed a mystery pea plant. Oh my gosh, what an exciting day. It's got tall stems and axial flowers, and you're asked to determine its genotype as quickly as possible. Okay, so a mystery plant, wouldn't that just make your day? So you got a mystery plant. We know its phenotype, right? We know what it looks like. We know it is tall with axial flowers. We're asked to determine its genotype. So its genotype is unknown at this point. Other stuff we know, tall is dominant to short or dwarf pea plants. And that axial flower position is dominant to terminal flower position. Okay, so again, we're writing down the stuff we know. Big T is dominant, the dwarf, and the axial flower. Okay, identify all the possible genotypes for your mystery plant. So that is part A. So our mystery plant is tall and axial. Well, the thing could be homozygous dominant, right? It could be heterozygous for both, right? Let's see. It could be heterozygous for tall and homozygous dominant for axial, or it could be homozygous dominant for tall and heterozygous for axial. So those are the possibilities. Part B, describe the one cross you would do out in your garden to determine the exact genotype of your mystery plant. Okay, so what can we do? Well, what I would suggest is what's called a test cross. We'll get into this more in chapter 15. So you have your unknown plant, right? So we know it's tall, but we don't know the second allele. We know it's got axial flowers, but we don't know the second allele. What works well is to mate it with a plant that has a known genotype. And one plant you can look at and know its genotype is one that is homozygous recessive. Okay, so again, I would do what's called a test cross. You have an unknown and you mate it with a known, and you know the genotype of a plant that is displaying the recessive phenotypes for all those traits. Okay. C, while waiting for the results, you predict the results of each possible genotype. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I'm not excited about doing all that. So let's say it would be big A, big A, big T, big T, big A, big A. If that was the genotype of the parent you did this test cross, then you would expect that all the offspring would be tall and axial, right? If one parent is homozygous dominant, the other is homozygous recessive, then all the offspring would be tall with axial flowers. Let's see. If it was heterozygous for both, so if it's heterozygous times little a, then you would expect, well, the offspring could be tall with axial flowers. They could be tall with terminal flowers. They could be dwarf, two little t's, with axial flowers. They could be dwarf with terminal flowers. So in this case, the offspring would have what's called a 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. So they could be tall and axial, they could be tall and terminal, they could be dwarf and axial, dwarf and terminal. So you get equal probabilities with all of them. What if you have a scenario where one parent or the mystery plant is tall and homozygous dominant for height and heterozygous for flower position, and again you do your test cross, then the offspring In that scenario, they would all be tall, and half of them would be tall with axial flowers and half would be tall with terminal flowers. And the last scenario we had here was that it was heterozygous for height and homozygous dominant for flower position. And we do our test cross. All of the offspring would have axial flowers. Half of them would be tall with axial flowers and half would be dwarf with axial flowers. Okay, so that's how we work through that. Okay, so, oh wait, I think that walks us through part D. Explain how the results and your predictions will help you learn the genotype. Well, again, the beauty of this is using a test cross. You know what one of the parents would be, and then you know that there are these possible outcomes, and then you just look at the ratios. If all the offspring are tall and axial, that tells you one thing. If you have 4 different outcomes and there's equal probability of all of them, that tells you a lot about the mystery plant. If the offspring are all tall with axial or terminal, or all axial and terminal, and some are tall and some are dwarf, again, that gives indication. So you can look at these ratios, the offspring, for the different phenotypes, and it will indicate what's going on. All right, well, hey, you made it through. Congratulations. If you have any questions on Chapter 14, let me know. Otherwise, hope you're doing well, and good luck with everything. Thank you.